is to me. So Hillel Neuer, who I to learn today is a Kohen, just like Matityahu Kohen, is defying in the hills of Modi'in and the streets of Geneva some of our toughest critics. So please welcome a modern day Maccabi, Hillel Neuer.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that very kind reception. As I'm coming here directly from the UN Human Rights Council, I'm not used to that kind of warm reception. When I walk in the room there, I'm greeted by various looks of death. But it's nice to receive your kind welcome, and I'm willing to make the adjustment. It's great to be here at this shul. I hear great things about your community, and I want to thank Alex for helping to arrange it. I don't have so much time today. I just want to share with you a few words about what's happening at the United Nations, the work that my organization, UN Watch, which is based in Geneva, Switzerland, is doing, and what are some of the challenges before us, and then take any questions that you may have. In the past 2 months, we witnessed the approach of the United Nations when it came to October 7th, and many people were shocked. Those of us who've been following the UN a bit more closely were horrified by the UN's response, but I can't say that we were shocked, but we were horrified. Let me share with you a few examples of the UN response. One, perhaps the most famous, was the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. Although on some occasions he has condemned Hamas atrocities, at the same time, he said at the United Nations, but the Hamas attacks did not happen in a vacuum, infamously. And then he went on to list all the Palestinian so-called grievances, effectively making the case for why what Hamas did had some basis. The Hamas attacks didn't happen in a vacuum. Of course, he didn't say nothing happens in a vacuum, right? Nothing in the world happens in a vacuum. So he was right that it didn't happen in a vacuum. He didn't mention that a UN agency called UNRWA employs 30,000 Palestinian staff in Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, that these teachers, as we found in our research, just by going on Facebook, systematically incite to jihadi terrorism. UNRWA school teachers and principals, you go on their Facebook page, you see pictures of them in school with their kids, the latest activity that they did, and then you see a picture of the latest Hamas terrorist attack where they're cheering it, a Hamas teacher saying that, calling on Muslims to slaughter every single Jew, other UNRWA teachers sharing pictures of Hitler, glorifying Hitler. These are systematic. So we found 150 cases of UNRWA teachers, principals, and other staff who incite to terrorism, killing of Jews, glorifying Hitler. We brought it to the United Nations, and they didn't want to hear about it. I'll give you a little bit more information about that in a moment. So the Secretary General didn't talk about UN teachers under his own jurisdiction who were inciting people of Gaza to attack. He didn't mention that the UNRWA, again, which is the essence of UNRWA, is to say that basically the Palestinians who left Palestine in 1948 and went to various places, the countries that I mentioned, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, that their home is not where they are now. So a Palestinian in Gaza doesn't believe that his or her home is in Gaza. They're told by UNRWA that your home is in Haifa and Tel Aviv and Lod and all these different places. So basically the point of UNRWA is to undo 1948. And so although the UN speaks of a two-state solution that they want, in fact, the whole point of UNRWA is to say that 1948 was a crime against the Palestinians and you need to undo 1948. So the world shouldn't be surprised that when we send billions of dollars, because billions of dollars have been sent to Gaza in the past couple of decades, when we send them cement, we shouldn't be surprised that even though the cement is designed to build homes, hospitals, and schools, that rather than using the cement for that, they used it, as we now see, to build miles and miles and miles of terror tunnels. All of Gaza underneath has miles and miles of sophisticated terror tunnels with cement that is built for terror tunnels to go and attack Israel and do the massacre that they did on October 7th and to destroy Israel, which they say they want to do, and they want to do it again. So the Secretary General didn't mention the responsibility of his own organization and what they taught generations of Palestinians, because many of the Hamas attackers were, just by numbers, I don't have the specifics, but you assume at least half of the Hamas attackers, the thousands of attackers, were graduates of UNRWA schools. So UNRWA says that they go to donors in Europe. America gives them over $300 million a year. And they say, we're bringing you stability. Well, you saw the stability on October 7th. So that's the Secretary General of the United Nations. That's the UN Relief and Works Agency, the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians. I'll mention maybe a few other examples of the UN. The humanitarian agencies, many of them based in Geneva, such as the World Health Organization, the Relief Agency, OCHA, UNICEF, if you saw their social media the past 2 months, overwhelmingly, they are blaming Israel explicitly or by implication. Often they'll just show a picture of Gaza, destruction, and saying that the war must end. They never call on, if you look at what they ask for, they're basically asking for exactly what Hamas wants. Hamas is being pummeled by Israel right now. Israel is slowly and meticulously going after Hamas. And you see these UN agencies saying a ceasefire. Well, you had a ceasefire for 2 years before October 7th. They do not call on Hamas to surrender, which would end the war. They do not call, very rarely, sometimes, but very seldom do they call for release of all the hostages. Hamas would surrender today and release all the hostages, the war would be over. But these UN agencies, instead, if you look at Dr. Tedros, the head of the WHO, you'll see the vast majority of his statements are condemning Israel. In addition, something that was not just happened at the UN, but was worldwide, is you'll see that UN agencies often either they ignore the responsibility of Hamas for the war. Hamas attacked. Of course, they knew Israel would respond. Hamas embeds themselves deliberately beneath homes, hospitals, schools, and mosques, deliberately so that they will incur civilian casualties to demonize Israel. And there's an ecosystem. And we saw that ecosystem at work on October 17th. October 17th, wherever you were in the world, you read the headline. It was front page of the New York Times website. Israel bombs hospital, the Al-Ali hospital. Israel bombs hospital, kills 500 people. The story went around the world, front page New York Times website, and AP, Reuters, everywhere. And it turns out it was completely false. The hospital was not attacked. It was next to the hospital. It wasn't Israel. It was Islamic Jihad. 500 people weren't killed, maybe 10, maybe more. We still don't know today. The moment they realized it wasn't Israel, nobody cared anymore. The daily counts only matter for much of the world if Israel can be blamed. The moment they realized it was Islamic Jihad, no one cared anymore. You don't hear about it. But a whole ecosystem went into work. Many UN officials put out the lie, saying, horrified, not just the UN, but those who are adjacent to the UN, such as groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, enormously influential non-governmental organizations, NGOs. They are quoted by all the world's leading media as the voices of virtue. This is what happened in the world. Here's what Amnesty International says. Here's what Human Rights Watch says. These are groups that have hundreds of millions of dollars and enormous staffs. And 2 years ago, each of them said Israel's apartheid in 100-page, 300-page reports. That contributed enormously to the demonization of Israel on campuses today. When people pull off the posters and everything of hostages, they do it in New York City and other places. Many of these people who are doing that have demonized Israel so much. Israel has been demonized in their consciousness, in part because groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch said the only country in the world that's an apartheid state, the evil, racist state in its essence, is Israel. So these groups, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, on October 17th, when Hamas put out the lie, individuals like Omar Shakir, who's the head of their Palestine unit, said, I've been to morgues, I've seen mass killings, I've seen horrors. This, I have no words. These are the worst scenes I've ever seen in my life. He wasn't in Gaza, so we don't even know what he saw, if anything. But I'm seeing pictures, I've never seen them in my life. No words, abject horror. And sharing something that blamed Israel. The tweet is still up there. Agnes Kalamar, the head of Amnesty International, also shared the lie that Israel committed it. As last time I checked, a couple days ago, the tweet was still up there. No retraction, no apologies. So whether it's the UN or groups that are adjacent to the UN, I say adjacent because they work very closely with the UN. Many of their leading officials are one day at the UN. Agnes Callamard used to be at the UN, a UN expert, then she worked for Amnesty, then they go back to the UN, operating in the same ecosystem. And sadly, something that those of you who just read the newspapers see, it reaches the media too. As I said, New York Times, front page. A few days later, they kind of retracted, apologized, in a much more obscure place, but the damage was done. So this is what we're up against. It's the demonization of Israel, completely turning the tables on who launched the war. You have one party, Israel, which is facing an enemy that is cynically exploiting civilians, embedding themselves deliberately beneath civilians, deliberately to incur civilian casualties. The leaders of Hamas say, we're ready to sacrifice millions. The leader of Hamas went on Arabic TV several weeks ago and said the Algerians, they sacrificed millions. The Russians in World War II sacrificed millions. The Vietnamese, we're willing to sacrifice. So he has no problem. They asked him, what are you doing about your refugees, your people in Gaza when there's war? They say, well, that's not our problem. They're refugees, the UN has to deal with them. We're underground. We deal with our fighters. And what happens to their fellow Palestinian men and women, he's not concerned. He says the UN has to deal with them. So this is Hamas. Israel's facing Hamas. And the world generally, the United Nations, groups like the International Red Cross, are overwhelmingly pointing the finger at Israel and saying, you mustn't violate international law. When Israel is trying very hard, as Colonel Richard Kemp, the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, said, he's aware of no other army in history that has exerted more efforts to comply with the rules of distinction, not to target civilians. Israel is targeting Hamas rockets. They're next to civilians, but Israel has to stop the rockets. They have to go after Hamas. They are operating within the rules of international humanitarian law, within the rules of the Geneva Conventions, within the rules of the laws of war. And no other army, not the United States or Britain or France or Canada or Australia, which were involved in bombing ISIS in Mosul and Raqqa and Iraq, the fight against the Taliban in Afghanistan. No one has faced the kind of challenges that Israel faces in Gaza and has exerted more efforts to avoid harming civilians. Of course, they are harmed, as happens in every war, especially when Hamas embeds themselves. Every civilian death is a tragedy, but Israel is complying with international humanitarian law. I personally know many of the lawyers, both regular duty and reserve duty, who are advising Israel where they can target, where they can't target. Hamas is the complete opposite. Hamas couldn't care less about the laws of war. They deliberately massacred civilians, rape, mutilate, torture. They deliberately trample on the rules of the laws of war and exploit them by embedding themselves in civilian areas using hospitals. So this is what we're up against. A word or two about my organization. I have a few more minutes. UN Watch is based in Geneva. We monitor the UN according to the principles of its own charter. Our work includes bringing human rights victims from around the world to testify at the United Nations. We've brought over 150 dissidents to testify in the past number of years. This means political prisoners in Russia, China, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, Cuba, and many other countries who too often are neglected at the UN. Too often their own regimes are elected to the Human Rights Council. Pakistan is a member of the Human Rights Council. China is a member of the Human Rights Council. They have 1 million Muslims herded into camps. I haven't seen anyone protesting for them in the streets of London, Paris, New York. I haven't seen hundreds of thousands of people marching, but China is elected to the Human Rights Council. Cuba is a member of the Human Rights Council. Kazakhstan, which massacred people in their capital, is a member of the Human Rights Council. So it's a very cynical place. We're trying to bring the victims of the worst dictatorships to have a voice. We organize the annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights. So we're active on the leading human rights issues of the day, working with some of the most famous dissidents or political prisoners who are in prison, like Vladimir Kara-Murza, sentenced to 25 years in prison, was just sent to Siberia in solitary confinement. He's a hero. He went to Moscow, spoke out against the war in Ukraine, knowing what his fate would be. He's languishing in solitary confinement. He's a friend of mine. We brought him to speak several times. I'm working with his wife, Evgenia, to try to bring attention to his case. So let's work what we're doing there. And we're fighting anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias. The UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, which should be addressing the world's worst situations, devotes one day at every one of its sessions. They meet 3 times a year in September, March, and June for a month. They follow an agenda of 10 items at every meeting. And there's one agenda item for the whole world. It's called Agenda Item 4, human rights situations around the world. Then you have Item 7, human rights violations in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories. So one agenda item for the whole world, 193 countries, one agenda item for Israel alone. No other country in the world, not Russia bombing Ukraine, not Syria bombing 500,000 of its own people with barrel bombs against hospitals, not North Korea, one of the most horrific places on the planet. None of these countries is the object of its own agenda item. If they get mentioned at all, it's under the generic agenda item. Only Israel has a special day, agenda item 7, devoted to Israel. We call it Hate Israel Day. And you could see, I've witnessed, there's a lot of psychology that you witness. You see that the moral inaction of all these crimes happening, and no one does anything in this body. I sit there at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and they don't do anything. And suddenly there's one day in Israel, and suddenly this rusty machinery springs to life, and they condemn Israel. Israel is the object of more resolutions, condemnations than any other country in the world. There are more condemnations of Israel than on Syria, North Korea, Iran combined at the Human Rights Council. And you see this rusty machinery, the whole year it's quiet, suddenly spring to life and condemn Israel, as they're doing now. The General Assembly just met to call for a ceasefire, which is targeted at Israel because Israel is now winning against Hamas, so they want it to stop to keep Hamas in power. So that's the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and so our work is combating anti-Israel bias. How do we do it? We, I would say, do 3 kinds of activity. One is advocacy. We meet with governments that are open to getting information and trying to encourage them to do the right thing. When the United Kingdom began to change their votes to vote against some of these anti-Israel resolutions, they cited our data. You can go on our website, unwatch.org. We have a special database, unwatch.org/database. You can see every country, how they vote, and explaining why these resolutions are so one-sided and so biased. The UN tries to pretend that they're balanced. We explain why they're not. And the UK cited our material when they explained why they changed their votes to vote no. We're also educating public opinion. You know, in many cases, the UN, you're going to lose the votes. The votes are so overwhelmingly against Israel. The Arab and Islamic states bring the votes. Many vote with them because there's vote trading. There's 56 Islamic states. If you vote with them, you get 56 votes. If you vote with the Jewish group of states, you get 1. So it's 56-1. Countries want the 56 Islamic votes. There's oil. If you don't vote with the anti-Israel resolutions, maybe you won't get oil. Sovereign wealth funds. Qatar has billions of dollars. If you don't vote for them, maybe you won't get the investments. So the odds are overwhelmingly in favor of the anti-Israel automatic majority, but the world needs to understand who stands behind the votes. People think that it's Human Rights Council as men with long white beards and white robes strolling along Mount Olympus, making their decisions based on facts, logic, and morality. If you go to Europe, you see the headline, UN Human Rights Council said most people in Europe, and even in Canada where I grew up, and in large parts of America, imagine Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato making the decisions of the UN Human Rights Council. The UN Human Rights Council said it's like, and the Lord spoke to Moses at Sinai, for many people around the world. But we explained to them that, in fact, the Human Rights Council, 70% of the members are either full-on dictatorships or other forms of non-democracies. China, Cuba, Libya, Qatar, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. When Iran was chosen to head a UN Human Rights Forum a few weeks ago in Geneva, we exposed it to the world. My friend Dan Smith helped make an incredible video. It was seen, I think, about 10 million times on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. The world heard Iran was chosen to be head of a UN Human Rights Forum, a regime that beats, blinds, poisons, tortures, rapes their own women and girls in Iran alone, let alone the fact that they sponsor Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis and other terrorist groups around the world. No one said a thing. The United States ambassador spoke out. She was the only one. Iran was chosen to be the head of this forum. And the dictator, Raisi, is coming to Geneva tomorrow to speak to the UN Global Refugee Forum. We're helping to bring several leading Iranian women's rights activists to demand that democracies not meet with this terrorist. So we're speaking out in social media. We're in the media, quoted several times a day, quoted in the Daily Telegraph. Tonight I should be on Newsmax at the 7 p.m. show. We are quoted in Die Welt, Le Point, Le Monde, AFP, Reuters, getting out the truth about what's happening at the United Nations. I mentioned social media. Our tweets have been seen in the past 2 months about 70 million times in terms of impressions. And on Instagram, Facebook. So certainly if you want to follow our materials, I encourage you to sign up on our website, unwatch.org. You'll get email alerts from time to time. We don't overwhelm you. And otherwise, you can follow me, Hillel Neuer, or UN Watch on especially Twitter and Instagram is where we're extremely active mostly. Finally, we hold abusers to account. I mentioned UNRWA. We have published numerous reports exposing how their teachers systematically incite to terrorism. And when I met with the Director General of a Norwegian-speaking country in Europe, I don't want to say which country, I was told, I said what I said. I was told that these are just a few bad apples at UNRWA, 150 teachers, a few bad apples. But the truth is that whenever one of these teachers posts incitement, you see his or her friends on the Facebook page saying, I'm with you 100%. Never have I seen, I'm shocked that you're supporting Hamas. Never. On the contrary, when a guy named Riyad Nimr, an UNRWA teacher in Lebanon, glorified the massacre of Jews in a synagogue in Jerusalem 10 years ago, we exposed it. UNRWA was on the defensive because America put on some pressure. They suspended him for a few weeks. And the whole UNRWA refugee camp in his place in Lebanon went on strike. The whole teachers union embraced him. All the Palestinian factions connected to UNRWA embraced him. Not a single protest saying we're shocked that Riyad Nimr glorified a massacre of Jews in a synagogue. On the contrary, they embraced him. They said he's a patriot. They went on strike for several days. It was a huge protest in Lebanon in support of this terrorist. So these are not bad apples. They embody what UNRWA teachers are doing. So we're exposing them. They're on the defensive. I testified in Congress a few weeks ago. It's been picked up by several members of Congress, senators on the Senate floor. I was in the Bundestag recently. We just sent 500 of our reports yesterday to Berlin to a member of parliament there who's distributing it to every member of the Bundestag. And this particular one, Frank Müller-Rosenstritt, has called for Germany to stop funding UNRWA. America gives over 300 million. Germany is giving 200 million. They're the second largest donor. So UNRWA is on the defensive. We helped expose the fact that one of the hostages testified that they were held, he or she, we don't know, was held actually by an UNRWA teacher in Gaza. This was reported by a journalist named Bokar Almog, and UNRWA was put on the defensive. They said, you have to delete this tweet, it's not true. The journalist said, it is true, it's testimony, and it's being picked up by numerous legislators and journalists. So we are at the front lines, holding UN bodies to account. We're going to keep fighting for the truth. Now is Hanukkah. I do want to end on an interesting note in that we've seen the past few months a number of people who were never felt comfortable speaking out on these issues have begun to speak out. I mean, here in America, for example. I mean, at the UN, I've had a number of UN staff approach me who said they're uncomfortable with what's going on. Jews and non-Jews telling me information, what's happening in their UN agency that I need to know about. That's really interesting, something that I welcome. I've seen in America how a famous investor, Bill Ackman, has begun speaking out against anti-Semitism at Harvard in a very impressive way. When I shared a few weeks ago, an editor at Human Rights Watch named Danielle Haas, she was an editor there for 12 years at Human Rights Watch, the organization that accused Israel of apartheid in a 300-page report. She left and she wrote an email, a detailed email, saying how as someone who's Jewish, when she tried to raise issues, and she was with them for 12 years, so she's not an opponent of the organization, she's one of them. When she tried to raise some issues, maybe about the apartheid thing, they didn't want to hear her at all. They didn't want to listen, and she described a series of experiences that she said amounted to anti-Semitism. And it's a very detailed email. I invite you, it's on our website, unwatch.org, Danielle Haas. When I shared it, it was reposted by Bill Ackman, the famous investor, and he said, I'm embarrassed. This is what he said. He said, I'm embarrassed. I gave them $10 million. Pershing Foundation gave them $10 million 10 years ago. I'm embarrassed. They're not credible. They've become political. So someone like that is now speaking out. Someone like Danielle Haas began speaking out. And we've seen other people in the past few weeks. So that gives me encouragement. Also to see that in Israel, we're seeing unity that we've never seen before. The people of Israel are united. Seeing Jewish people here in America and around the world are united as never before. In this crisis, I'm seeing unity. And we are here on Hanukkah, and I'm reminded that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, when the Israeli ambassador to the UN, who's now the Prime Minister of Israel, when he went to see the Rebbe before going to the UN, he told him, the Rebbe said, you're going into a place of darkness, the United Nations, and in a place of darkness, your job is to light a candle. So if you light a candle, you can bring light to the whole room. We are often in a place of darkness, and we're trying to light the candle of truth. Happy Hanukkah.
I'll take a few questions. Just raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Okay. Let's start with Alex.
Can you just talk about the new resolution? They haven't done it for 4 decades. To your point of like Israel is a special thing. And their act section 99, and just what is that? And the fact that they've done it for decades.
Yeah.
Speaks to everything that you're talking about. There's nothing been worse in the world
Right.
over 4 decades.
Right.
Than Israel.
Right. Yeah, indeed. Just a few days ago, last week, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, the one who said, well, Hamas, he said the Hamas attacks are terrible, but at the same time, they didn't happen in a vacuum. He invoked a provision in the Charter of the United Nations, which allowed him to convene a meeting of the UN, because he said he's seeing things that are worse than ever happened before. And so they convened because the Security Council met, and the United States vetoed the resolution. It was a one-sided resolution that did not call on Hamas to surrender, did not condemn their taking of the hostages in any meaningful way, and tried to basically keep Hamas in power by stopping Israel from going after them right now. So the General Assembly, there is no veto, right? The veto is only in the Security Council. America cannot block a resolution that's unfair in the General Assembly or at the Human Rights Council or anywhere else, only there. So what the dictatorships do is if it fails in the Security Council, they bring it to the GA. There, it'll pass automatically. And so that's what they did, and the Secretary General invoked this provision where he could basically convene a meeting. And indeed, as Alex said, he has said, as some of his tweets have said before, that we're seeing things that are unprecedented, which is, of course, perverse. Israel is defending itself from a terrorist group. If anything is unprecedented, it's the fact that it's a terrorist group that embeds itself in homes, hospitals, and schools, and that the world, much of the world, tends to support them and is willfully blind to the fact of what Hamas is doing. From time to time, they'll mention that Human Shields is wrong and to acknowledge what Hamas is doing, but it's really the exception. So it's several times, several UN people have tried to use this language, unprecedented. And if you examine the facts, whether it's the numbers or the quality of what's going on, you see that what Israel is doing is certainly not worse than what other democracies do fighting terrorist groups. And indeed, as experts say, like Colonel Richard Kemp and other generals that we brought US generals to speak at the UN in 2014, and they said Israel is doing things that is going to make our life hard because you're creating new standards that we in the US never exercised in Iraq and Afghanistan. So if Israel was doing roof knocking and all kinds of warnings before they attack, and the U.S. generals that we brought said, we don't do this, and if you do this, you're going to make our life harder.
Thank you for the work. Just want to make a comment. I lived in Israel and in South Africa during the apartheid. There's no resemblance of apartheid claim in Israel to what was happening in South Africa. I think calling Israel apartheid state is an insult to millions of South African black people who suffered under the regime. My question is, what is the benefit for Israel to be part of the UN?
Okay, well, thank you for your statement, and indeed, I fully agree with you. I visited South Africa only a couple of times, but to see the horrors of apartheid and to see how those who cynically use that term against Israel, not only have they succeeded in demonizing Israel and putting Jews at risk around the world, but they completely throw under the bus the cause of anti-racism in Africa. Because you will verify for me that in South Africa, blacks under apartheid were not voting in the parliament. They were not being elected to the parliament. They were not members of the coalition. As a couple of years ago, there was an Arab Islamic party as member of the coalition. There were not black judges and all the rest. So the thing is completely. Yeah. Anyone who goes to Israel today, I spend a lot of time in Jerusalem. You will see Arabs everywhere, and they are working. They're managers of malls and everything. And I'm not going to go into that more here. You asked about why is Israel part of the UN? People ask from time to time. It's so the injustice is so extreme. why should Israel be part of a procedure that is so unjust? By being there, they're legitimizing it. And it's a very powerful question. And I would say that there are certain instances where Israel does absent itself based on that logic. For example, the Durban conference in South Africa in 2001 was supposed to be against racism. It became hijacked by anti-Semites, became an anti-Semitic hate fest. And Israel and the United States pulled out in 2001. In 2009, there was the sequel in Geneva next to our office. And there, 10 countries pulled out. And then there was commemorations of Durban last year, and 38 countries pulled out. So those are instances where there's a conference or there's a proceeding in The Hague that is completely unfair, where it makes sense for Israel not to legitimize that proceeding or that conference. But to pull out of the United Nations would actually be an own goal, because any country that wants to be recognized as a sovereign, independent state wants the nameplate to be at the United Nations. And the United Nations offers you tremendous opportunities to connect with governments around the world. It gives you a global forum. So unfortunately, it would not really be a solution. Israel would be even more excluded. It would make its enemies even happier. The enemies are happy to exclude Israel from any international forum. So it's a difficult place to be at. And I can tell you, because I have the scars from being there and being among the Israel haters and the dictators. But there's no magic bullet. There's no easy solution. Even if you pull out of the UN, in Switzerland, I'm in Geneva. You go to Zurich, there's FIFA, that's the world, soccer, the football federation. The Palestinians wanted to kick Israel out of that too and pass resolutions. So, Israel could pull out of FIFA, they could pull out of the International Red Cross Federation, they could pull out of everything. Its enemies would only be happier. So Israel needs to be there. They need to have representatives who know how to make their case before the world. And it's a very difficult battle, but unfortunately, I don't see any solution. It doesn't mean that Israel can't sometimes be aggressive, as it has been recently in denying visas to some biased UN officials. So it's a difficult game to play, but pulling out, unfortunately, would not be the solution.
Okay, I'm going to spit out a few questions. Do you ever get traction on CNN, MSNBC, BBC? 2, in my lifetime, I know there's always been huge anti-Semitism, but it just feels like the largest in my lifetime, and the breadth and depth, and it's not just, Muslim people, it's like the West. It's just caught the imagination of the West and young people and all that. Is this new to you, and what do you think is feeding this? And thirdly, just any tips, aside from supporting your organisation, what will you do?
Alex?
What is thank you for enlightening presentation. What is your insight on psychology of wealthy Americans and Europeans who support pro-Hamas human rights organizations and organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, when they are, etc., etc.? What's the end goal?
Veronica?
So a couple weeks ago, I went to this conference at my former school. There was a Palestinian journalist, a psychologist from Harvard on Zoom, and a Reform rabbi. And I asked them this question: how can Jews and Palestinians make peaceful dialogue on college campuses? And the Palestinian journalist and psychologist said that everything is okay, you don't need to worry about it. And the Reform rabbi did not reply. So I'd like to know your opinion.
Okay, I'll try to address various questions. I was asked, have I got traction on CNN, BBC? I have been on CNN TV a few times, not recently, but I've been on a few times in the past. BBC, I've been on, I think their radio, I don't know if it was on their TV. Certainly BBC institutionally is hostile. Some of you may have seen various clips that were shared. There's a few famous ones. I'll mention just one of them, which was that a news presenter gave some news that that Israel is entered Shifa Hospital, and they're targeting Arab speakers and medics, I think was the term. It didn't make any sense. And then you saw that the statement that the IDF had put out a few hours earlier was that Israel is going into Shifa Hospital because Hamas had a headquarters there, terror tunnels below there. They had brought hostages, they kidnapped hostages and brought them to Shifa Hospital. We saw the film clips. And Israel said they've sent in to, because they need to go into the hospital because the terrorists are there, but they don't want to hurt the patients. They've sent in specially trained Arabic speakers to go into the hospital to help patients go out of the way to help babies, whatever it is, and specially trained medics. So Israel specially trained the procedure for how they would go into the hospital, not harm the patients, and go after the terrorists. And BBC just saw it and completely twisted it. Okay, I don't think they did it deliberately, but it's sort of, I guess, Freudian. They're so anti-Israel that they saw something, said Israel is going to the hospital, and they're targeting Arabic speakers, which makes no sense. What do you mean they're targeting Arabic speakers in Gaza and medics? And anyway, so that was just like a shameful thing. So that's the BBC. I'm willing to go on these things, and I'm trying to do as much of this as we can. In terms of anti-Semitism in my lifetime, I would say that I have seen instances of all of these things that we're seeing, because I have seen these things at the United Nations, but the degree I never saw. So I'd say, it seems to me, as someone who studies this issue, that the degree of anti-Semitism, the way it's come out in a raw form in so many places around the world, we probably haven't seen since the Holocaust. And why that's happened, I don't have the time here, but it is interesting that you might think that when Israel was assaulted in such a vicious, brutal way, in such a massive way on October the 7th, mutilation and torture and all the other sadistic, terrible things against some 1,200 people, you would think there'd be some sympathy for Israel. But it's interesting that someone said that when the lamb cries out, the wolves start to get hungry. And so it seems that when Israel was crying out, wolves around the world started getting excited. Wolves started getting excited. And we saw vicious anti-Semitism come out in streets all across the world, in Europe, in Canada, Montreal, where I grew up. There was shootings against Jewish schools. Thank God no one was hurt. But crazy things all around the world. So in my opinion, it seems to be the most raw anti-Semitism that we've seen since the Holocaust. What can we do? Each of you is in your own community, and I'm sure there's so much that you need to do in different places, whether it's to help people in your synagogue, in your community, fighting bias in the media. For us at UN Watch, ways to get involved, sign up on our website. That's just so at least you know what's going on, unwatch.org. Sometimes there's things where we're asking the United States to get involved, so each of you has a member of Congress that you could write to. So I invite you to sign up, and you could find out ways you can get involved, certainly to share our material on social media and any other way. Please do so. Those who want to support us, we're a US 501c3, tax deductible, can go on our website and can make donations. We are supported entirely by private donations. Two other questions I'll try to get to. What is the psychology of those who support Hamas? It's not rational. I mean, what we see in Europe, when you see these Jeremy Corbynites, where you had, 300,000 people marching, where you see people who are, I mentioned Jeremy Corbyn, he was the leader of the Labour Party, who is in name progressive. He is for equal rights for gays, for women, for any kind of minority. The last group in the world that he should be marching with would be Hamas, which is completely anti-gay, completely anti-woman, completely anti-equality, completely racist and anti-Semitic. So it is fundamentally irrational of this red-green alliance, the red socialists marching with the green Islamists. It's irrational. The only thing that unites them, the main thing, two things I would say. One is anti-Semitism. They both seem to hate the Jews. Jeremy Corbyn said, literally, Hamas and Hezbollah are my friends. They are social justice movements, right? Hamas and Hezbollah are social justice movements. That's what Jeremy Corbyn said. What unites them is hatred for Israel and Jews, and some kind of hatred of America and the West. That is the only underlying motivation. So I think that's the psychology, in my opinion. In terms of how Palestinians and Jews can come together, right? Was that your question? I don't really have the answer today on how they can come together on campus. I would hope that Palestinians should see what Hamas is doing and say, this is not us. I mean, it has to begin with that. Certainly Israelis over the years, when they felt that their government did something that was wrong, they said, they protested. I don't see anyone in the Palestinian community standing up. There are a handful of people, but nothing noticeable saying we are horrified. We could say we hate Israel, we don't like Israel, but we're horrified at what happened, targeting civilians, the terrible things. It has to begin with that. So we're going to need to see from the Palestinian side some kind of condemnation of the horrific attacks. If that happens, then I see no reason why Jews and Palestinians can't come together over that. And certainly we hope We hope that as people, they will come together. We saw in Israel something very interesting, I'll end with this, is that Israeli Arabs, there was concern at the beginning that Israel would face all kinds of fronts from Hezbollah, from Iran, and that Arabs within Israel, about 2 million Arabs within Israel, thankfully, the Arabs within Israel have not sided with Hamas, and according to polls and many other things, on the contrary, they are really condemning what Hamas did and are, if anything, more identified with the state of Israel than ever before. So that shows some hope. Thank you very much.